You are listening to the Small Town Big Talk Show, the weekly podcast for small town people with big dreams and ideas. I'm your host, Rebecca Undum, and each week we'll cover a topic meant to inspire, encourage, and empower you to live big in your small town. Although it has its challenges, nothing beats small town living, and we're committed to sharing the best of what's working in the communities we serve. So enjoy this episode, and we hope it helps you to bloom where you've been planted. My guest on today's episode is Tiffaney Holm. Tiff is a corporate trainer at First International Bank and Trust in Fargo, North Dakota, where she combines her passions of training, retention, and employee engagement with her ability to inspire others to be their best, truest selves. Tiff's a former colleague of mine, and today she joins me on the podcast to discuss a challenging topic. We're chatting about mental health. And even though this is something that we're getting better as a society at talking about, in small towns, we still have a difficult time with it. There's still quite a stigma around the people that we know and love that are struggling with mental health. Today, Tiff comes on to share her very personal story and how she and her family have dealt with a variety of different mental health challenges. And most importantly, what we spend a lot of time talking about is how every single one of us can better support the people that we love. And this also ends up, if you yourself are struggling with a mental health crisis, things that you can do to take care of yourself, to ask for help, and to be supported. In the show notes, there are links to a couple of organizations. If you are struggling right now, I would encourage you to head right out to the show notes and look up those resources, because you shouldn't be struggling and you don't have to struggle all on your own. Enjoy this chat, this difficult chat, and hold some love and space for my good friend, Tiff. Welcome to the show, Tiff.
Thank you.
I'm so happy to have you here.
Well, I'm excited to be here.
This is one of those topics that I've talked a lot about kind of in bits and pieces. And in fact, in last week's newsletter that goes out to kind of my email people, I talked a little bit and talked about you sharing your story. And just some of the takeaways that you shared in that exact context where we were together a couple weeks ago now. So I always knew that I wanted to dive into this topic a little more fully. And I honestly, after hearing your story and knowing that you were raised in a small town, you grew up in a small town, I couldn't think of anybody better to have chat this out with me. So sure. I know that it's hard. It's a hard topic. But I am so grateful to you for coming on and being willing to share a bit of your story.
Yeah, and I am glad that you are picking a difficult topic to talk about. We need to talk about it.
Right. That's one of the biggest things that we, you and I chatted a bit about after your talk at the conference was, like, this is just one of those things that not talking about it doesn't diminish it in any way. I mean, this is the thing that we have to somehow become comfortable with, the uncomfortable nature of it, because keeping it in the dark only makes it harder and more shameful. It's harder to get help. It's harder for the families that are supporting a person that maybe is struggling. And so, yeah, I agree. It's something we need to become much better at, just being open to discussing. So hopefully this is one small step in that direction.
Yeah.
Would you, for the benefit of the listeners, share, and you can kind of go back and talk about, I realize there's quite an arc to your personal story, but and you can share as much or as little as you want, but I would say start at the beginning and you get to choose what that looks like. Just kind of fill in a bit of your backstory. We know, obviously everybody listening already knows that the topic is mental health. So what has been your experience and where did it start for you?
Sure. So since you mentioned that I grew up in a small town, I guess I'll start there. So I grew up north of Fargo in a small town called Harwood. I want to say population is right around 800, really kind of more of a suburb of Fargo, but a small community nonetheless, where everybody knows everybody.
Right. And I want to because a lot of people listening will be like, well, that's not a small town. So I just want to make
sure.
a legit plug for the fact that when we're talking about what you experienced, it is a small town because your school system was small. Like obviously you can drive to Fargo. So you don't have the convenience issues that a lot of us face in small towns, but you still had that very small town feel in terms of the actual community that you were in, right? And your school system was small.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I think my elementary class, I maybe had, I want to say 12 to 15 in my class.
Yep,
and
small.
We certainly had the convenience of, a 15-minute drive into town, into Fargo. But it's still a place where you wave at everybody, you recognize everybody. You've got your two small hometown bars, and everybody in there, and whose vehicles are parked in that parking lot as well. No judgment,
right?
But you do know everybody, and you've likely known them from a very, very young age and grew up together as well.
Right. So, town of about 1,800 people or 800 people.
About 800, yeah.
Tiny class too. Tell a little bit more. Yeah. What happened?
Sure. So grew up out there with my mom and dad, and I have an older brother. He's 3 years older than me, and came from a very happy, healthy home. We were a very close family. I like to tell people that, we didn't live an extravagant life, but we never went without. We had everything that you needed to be truly happy. And so great family, great upbringing. And then I would say probably the pivotal moment in my life, one of the defining moments of my life would have been when I was 13. I woke to the sound of my mom screaming, and in the early hours of the night, and went into the kitchen to find her surrounded by several police officers. I said, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" The cops asked me where my brother was. They followed me to his bedroom. And I told my brother, wake up, something's wrong with mom. My brother sat up in bed, and at that point, one of the police officers said, "Kids, your dad's dead. He shot himself." And so that is actually how we found out my father had taken his life. I later found out that he had been on medication and had seen a counselor for about 18 years, which this was probably close to 30 years ago now. And so at the time, to be getting help and seeking treatment like that, I didn't know anything about it. I honestly had no idea that my father had struggled with mental health issues, had been on medication, had saw a counselor. I had no idea until the night he died that he had struggled. So it really, I hate to call it a defining moment, because I think of that as like, what was the thing that was a positive impact? But it is a huge part of who I am, who my family is. And then obviously the reaction of being in a small town. And I'm sure by noon that next day, everyone in the community likely knew, and whether or not they were talking directly to us about it somewhere, and I'm sure some talking behind us about it as well. But, I remember what it felt like going back to school, and it didn't, while it was a huge part of who I am, and I accept that now and what it is, how in a lot of ways it's made me a better person, and I've grown from that experience, but I also didn't want to be defined by it. And I was extremely concerned about how it would be perceived, honestly, by other people. And I feel like I've spent a majority of my life defining my father's character because of the way he died, instead of being able to just celebrate what a wonderful man he was while he was with us.
Right. Okay, Tiff. So many things. I knew this about you. You and I worked together in it feels like entirely different lifetime, but let's put that aside. And when I heard you tell your story, on stage, right? There were so many things I just thought, there's so much that other people can learn from this experience that, I'm just so terribly sorry that you and your family had to go through. And yet I think, again, of course it's a defining moment for you personally. I actually think some of the most defining things for most of us are the times that we were just blindsided by pain. Unfortunately, it's absolutely the things that build character. So I think that's understandable. But what I wondered, and these questions, I don't know how to sensitively ask these questions. So I'm just going to tell you that straight away. This is where I think we suck so bad at talking about this that we don't even feel equipped. I know what I'm trying to ask you, and I may not say it quite right. And I feel like you'll give me grace through that because you're you, and everyone else can hear me struggle because this is what it is. But when I think about this for you, and I think it's also the time, the time and period that we were in, right? It would have been the 80s, right? Almost 90s, early 90s.
Yeah.
Early 90s. Okay. So
let's not tell people my age here, okay, Rebecca?
Well, okay. You said 30 years ago. You already kind of outed yourself, Tiff. I'm sorry.
So not quite 30. Yeah. Somewhere between probably 25 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things I'm so curious about, and this maybe will dovetail a little bit into your present reality with mental health awareness and the work that you're doing around that. Do you think and you were only what, 13 you said, right? When this happened. Yep. Do you feel like you were not betrayed isn't the right word. That's too strong. But did you feel like, how the hell did I not know this? Did you feel like your parents kept it from you? And obviously being 13, you had a lot of your own stuff going on. And that's what parents do, right? We shield our kids from a lot of times from the truth. But do you feel like it would have made a difference had you known? And does that influence the way you think about it today, working and living and guiding your own children? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. That's my question.
Yeah. So, and boy, there's a lot there. And yeah. So first of all, being a 13-year-old girl is super fun, and you're already going through so much,
so much
anyway, and your own feelings and emotion. And I do think to some extent that we were shielded. I wonder if my brother maybe had a greater understanding being a little bit older than me, in having conversations with my mom now as an adult about some of the events that occurred and some of his medical history in the past, and just trying to gain a better understanding about who my dad was and the struggles that he went through now as an adult, and having my own family. I think she was actually surprised that I wasn't a little bit more aware of it, but I think I really had my dad on a pedestal, and he was just so funny and so strong and so charismatic. He was one of those people that when he walked into a room, you knew he was there. And honestly, one of those people that, and you hear this so much after the loss of someone from suicide, they were the last person I would have ever expected, or they always seemed so happy. And you hear that a lot. Right. And I think my dad was a really, really good example of somebody that I think did a good job of kind of masking his pain and what he was really feeling. And, he was a soldier. And so I wonder if there was some of PTSD perhaps in there as well that was impacting his health. But we were also told that because he had been feeling well, they believe he stopped taking his medication, and that may have had played some role in it as well.
Sure.
So I do think I was shielded a little bit from it. What I can tell you now, since you did ask, how has that impacted the way I maybe even talk with these things with my children? It is a concern I have. I worry about our kids, and I really try to talk about feelings and big feelings and feelings that are maybe bigger than ourselves sometimes. And what does that look like? And if you need space, or if you need to talk, or if you need to take some deep breaths. And I think because there's a certain level of guilt that comes along with losing someone to suicide that I think when you lose other family members, you maybe don't experience the same type of guilt. And so feeling like, what didn't I see? What didn't I recognize? But also being a little bit more forgiving with myself now as an adult, because I realized that I was a child. But I do think that as an adult now, I think I'm a little bit more intuitive into picking up on nonverbal cues from people. And, what is this person typically acting like? And is this normal behavior? Is this just an off day, or is this something more serious? And has it been lasting a little bit longer than expected? And what can I do to help them feel supported? And I think just being a little bit more aware of other people's emotions and feelings. And like I said, even nonverbals are important.
Right. So this will be the hardest thing about this conversation, is because I want to go like every single direction that we can with it. But I think, going back to you feeling like he put on a strong front. And I think and I know that this is something important to you as well. He really was strong. It's not like that was just a facade. But I think, again, that parent and child role where we just say, I don't want them to know that I'm struggling because I don't want to scare them, or I don't want to alarm them. And yet I think that's the reason, that right there, and maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like that is part of the reason that this is still such a stigmatized conversation. There's so much stigma around it still. And I think that's why it's partly shielding, it's partly protecting people that we love and care about. And it's partly because we don't know, like, as a support person, we can't actually always do anything, right? So sometimes, do you think that that's part of it too? that people go, well, I'm not going to burden my loved ones with this conversation because they can't help me. And then we feel like, well, how can we help them? Which you're getting into that a little bit, right? With the idea of just being aware, like what should we be looking for in the people that we love and care about? And for me, I'm talking my whole community, right? I live in this small town. I really care about these people, even if they're not my best friends. I worry about people,
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, and it's interesting too, because the way we talk about any other medical condition, because what we are talking about is typically a medical condition that someone is dealing with, we wouldn't expect anybody to not go and get treatment or seek help for anything else. And yet people are still so ashamed to talk about their own struggles or asking for help and getting help. And I read so many different articles on this topic, and even in looking at this and looking at some different small town perspectives on this as well.
Right.
But one that I saw was comparing it to if your vision is not clear, you go in and you get eyeglasses. And if your brain is not thinking clearly, why wouldn't you do the same thing to help you think clearer? You want to see clear. Why not get help? And I certainly don't want to throw a bunch of stats and numbers and make this a super boring conversation. But one of the things that, is 1 in 5 people struggle with this, 1 in 5. And for adolescents, it's actually 1 in 4. But when you think about that number and how many people it's impacting, yet 90% of people still believe there's a stigma around talking about it. And that needs to change. We need to start having more of these conversations. And even though it may be uncomfortable for you to ask some of these things, the more we do it, the easier it will get.
Right. Yeah. And I think, it's really funny because if anybody that's in a small town and has spent any amount of time in a small town, I bet every single one of us and all the people listening have attended a benefit for somebody's cancer, right? Or whatever the case might be. We rally around each other. We really do. And that's one of the amazing things. Like your family goes through something, people rally, but it does not look the same for mental health. And I'm not saying that it should, I'm not saying we should organize benefits necessarily, but I am simply pointing out just the drastic difference in our ability to hold space for that with people. I really, truly in my heart believe that it's part culture. I think, we live in the Midwest where we're very stoic by nature. And I was 100% raised, just get your shit together, kid. Your big feelings, you're making a fool of yourself and it's not productive. And the whole, put your big girl panties on and deal with it. All of those phrases that really do affect, I think, those of us that move through the world with big feelings. Because I certainly count myself among even that population of people. And that is separate even from, actual mental health concerns, right? But I just think we're a stoic culture. And I really believe in my heart, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this. I really do believe that a lot of people still believe that it's all in their head, air quotes.
Oh, yeah.
You really are just a shade of crazy. Instead, I really do believe that people, they don't view it the same as having a physical medical condition or concern.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think you hear a lot of time, or it's somebody is craving attention, and that's why they're, it's there's one or two things. They're either, figure it out and deal with it on your own, or for those that have consistently asked for help, then I think there's this idea of that they're seeking attention until unfortunately there's a tragedy. And then I think the dialogue changes to, why didn't they ask for help?
Exactly.
I had no idea. It shouldn't have to come to a tragedy in order for people to feel comfortable. And you think about, and then add the complexity of being in a small town. And I joked about recognizing the vehicles outside of your local bar. But now imagine if you know what truck I'm driving, am I comfortable parking that outside of a counselor's office? So now the whole town knows that I'm there.
Exactly.
And why should I care?
Right.
But we do.
That's just it. As you and I are chatting about this, I don't know who's going to hear this episode. I never do, obviously. But if our medical professional, if there's any medical professional listening to this and you serve a small community, I encourage you to think really hard about how you reach the people in small towns. Because, okay, so access to those mental health professionals is challenging to begin with, right? I think across the board, everyone can agree with that in rural communities. But we are fortunate in Oaks. Our Sanford Health offers that kind of counseling. And, it kind of runs the gamut of what this professional will come and do. But in order to seek their assistance, you have to go to their clinic. And so it's one of those things where it's like, then that the admin people know. And of course, the admin people are bound by HIPAA. I'm not an idiot. Like, I get that. But I think it really still does create a hang up for people where even if the person behind the desk can't say anything to anybody else, that they know. And that makes people really uncomfortable. It just does. And I'm not saying I have an answer, Tiff. It's something that concerns me because I think fewer people are seeking out the help than they would otherwise because they're that uncomfortable. And then, like, what's the practicality of driving to Fargo? If you have to see the person, that's not practical.
Right. Agree. And I'm just gonna keep beating this, right? But I think that's why people continuing to have these types of discussions and conversations is really the only way we're going to move the needle on people feeling comfortable going and getting help.
Right. It's amazing. I've been having so many conversations with people I care about lately, just trying to encourage them that is not abnormal. Like, again, like your statistics, 1 in 5 people, I honestly want to be like, well, you're like in the norm entirely. It just doesn't feel like it to you, And, to this point, I would love it if you would maybe chat a little bit about the difference between situational mental health crises and mental illness, because that's something I think is, again, really important. And it isn't necessarily about diminishing the seriousness of somebody it's situational. But I don't even think, I don't think people even get that happens, Like, okay, so if you would be willing to share that, because I think there's a lot of value in that for people that might be listening to.
Sure. Yeah. And I feel like I need to preface this by saying, like, I am not a doctor. I am not a licensed counselor, any of those things. So I potentially, if I get any of this wrong, I'm not going to be ripped of my credentials because, but I want to make sure that clear. It's just something that has impacted me personally, and that's why I speak to it. But typically with situational depression, it's almost exactly as it sounds. So it's oftentimes an individual is going through a difficult period in their life, whether it's, a separation, losing a family member. It could even, I think of back to this small town theme here, even, harvest and what's happening with crops often can impact individuals as well. That's real. The stress of a job and maybe transitions, a loss of a job, all those things can lead to situational depression. It's still serious. It's still very real. It still impacts a person's ability in their typical day-to-day in a way that they normally would, because often it's impacting your ability to think clearly. So, there's ways to cope and there's people to talk to. And, I will never force medications on anyone. And again, I am not a doctor, but for some people during even situational times, it may be necessary for them as well. The difference between that and oftentimes, a clinical diagnosis of a mental illness is that situational, as things get better, oftentimes those individuals may be able to come off of a medication or things get better at work or they're working their way through a grieving process. And so things are slowly getting better. Typically, when you're diagnosed with a mental illness, it's always going to be there and it's going to ebb and flow and you're going to have highs and you're going to have lows. And sometimes the highs last much longer. And maybe you have, there's a day, 1 month where things are not great, but it's always there and it's something that you're typically going to be treated for your entire life, or hopefully you're treated for in some capacity, whether that's medication or counseling or diet and exercise, whatever it is that works for you, because everybody's going to be a little different. But, it's often compared to even like a type 1 diabetes. So when you're diabetic, your pancreas is not able to produce insulin the way a healthy pancreas in another individual would be. And so you take insulin to help regulate that. And with proper treatment, you can live a normal, healthy life. Well, it's the same when you're diagnosed with a mental illness. With proper treatment, you can live a normal, healthy life, but it's making sure that you get the treatment that's best for you. So I think, and hopefully I explained that in a way that makes sense, but that's probably the biggest difference between the two. And it doesn't mean that if you are suffering from, and mental illness could be depression. It could be generalized anxiety disorder. It could be even eating disorders, schizophrenia. So, there's several different types of mental illness, but it doesn't mean that it's always a constant for those individuals either.
Right. I appreciate, because this is a nuanced conversation. That's the other thing. It's not like, and I think going back to your story with your dad had been seeking both treatment in the form of medication and likely some counseling, it sounded like anyway, for a large part of his adult life. And it sounds as though it's possible that he felt like he had reached a point where he could cease doing that. And again, not to like blame what happened on that decision or anything, but it's recognizing that there is a difference, that an actual diagnosis is going to require ongoing treatment of some nature, that it's something that actually has to be managed, right? And again, situational does as well. But I think where this really gets interesting is when I think the real lens to look at this through is from the perspective of those of us trying to help somebody. And I think is where you have so many important things to share. And I'm hoping you'll just share a few things of just, and again, not to say like, we're walking around super sensitive, so don't say these things, like the whole what to say and what not to say. But I think it's valuable. I think people want to know how to support people, and we don't have the words. So we kind of default back on the cliche things that we think are going to help, and they don't. So would you be willing to share a few of the takeaways that you shared when you were, and the coolest thing about what you were doing, where we were when you shared this, was with a company. And it was in the context of, as a company and an employer, like if you're a boss and you have people that you lead every day, how do you pay attention? Like, what's our role in that? And I think obviously there's value in that, but there's value in the relationship we have with other community members and certainly with our family, right?
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
What's some of the things we should say, and but maybe better ways to say the same thing?
Sure. And a lot of these things are a little bit more even personal for me, and that's where this is coming from. So obviously, if we're going to be talking about being more transparent about these things, full disclosure here, I am also an individual who has been diagnosed with depression and anxiety. And so a lot of these statements are things that I've heard in people who have tried to help me through difficult times. And then in talking to other people, when I've said, how have you felt when people have said this to you? There's a general consensus on some things that help and maybe don't help. And so I guess some of the things that I would suggest against saying to people are, and I think you maybe said this earlier, is just it's all in your head, or happiness is a state of mind, and you just need to make a conscious effort to be more happy. If it were that easy, this wouldn't be as huge of an epidemic as it is.
Right.
Yes, I can choose joy and I can choose happiness, but my brain doesn't work the same way as other individuals do. So for me, I do require medication, which I guess that would be another thing that I've suggested to people too, is that if an individual is having a bad day, I would highly suggest you don't say things like, did you forget to take your medication today? It doesn't work that way.
Right.
We still feel things. It certainly helps rationalize some of those thoughts and feelings, but it doesn't make us numb either, which I'm grateful for. I don't want to be a robot. I would say probably one of the biggest things would be when people start to point out all the things you should be grateful for. You have a great husband, you have beautiful children, you have a beautiful home, you have a great job. Hearing that and having those things pointed out actually just makes a person feel ungrateful on top of everything else, because I'm aware that I have all those things. And now I just feel like you're right. And I don't even appreciate them. And that's not true. It's harder to get through some of those feelings when you're in a bit of a dark place. And so it's one of the things that I caution people towards pointing out. And I know I keep comparing it to other illnesses, but I've heard that piece talked about with Aaron, somebody who has asthma. So, you would never say to somebody with asthma, why are you having such a hard time breathing when there's all this air around you? Okay.
Oh, I love that, Tiff. I've never heard that before. I've never heard that. What a great analogy. I think people sometimes need analogies, like in situations like this, because I just think it's helpful. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So those, I mean, I guess that's just a few of the things that I would say, be careful about saying these types of things. So, what do I say then? I think it's totally okay to say that you don't know what to say. It's okay to not know how to solve the problem, because oftentimes individuals aren't looking for you to solve the problem. They're just looking for somebody to be there. I think it's okay to say, is everything okay? Is there anything you want to talk about? Are you comfortable talking? Do you just want me to be here with you? I think the biggest thing is just being there, just being present and showing up. If you ask somebody how you can help, or do you want me to bring you something to eat, they're oftentimes not going to accept your offer because they're not feeling worthy even of the help. Yeah. So just showing up. And I think for people who are struggling and have asked for help and maybe haven't gotten the help you look for, sometimes you got to find your person. You may find somebody who's like, I'm not equipped to deal with this, and so I'm just, going to walk away from this one. Don't give up. Find somebody else. Find somebody who will be there, who will step up, who will show up and be present. You mentioned the conference and we talked a little bit about this, but I did have a gentleman that came up to me afterwards and he's like, I have been saying all the wrong things. Right. And he was so worried about it. And I just said, that's why we're talking about it. And at the end of the day, let's not focus on the fact that you maybe said some things that in fact weren't as helpful as you would have liked them to be, but more importantly, you were there. Yeah. I've never looked at somebody and been angry for a comment like that. This is more about just creating some awareness about, what helps and what maybe can be more hurtful than you're expecting it to. But ultimately just showing up is the biggest thing and being there.
For sure. Because the other thing too is I think like when we start saying, don't do this and don't do that, then people are like, oh, screw that. I'm out. Like, I'm just not not gonna wade into this discussion at all. And I don't want to scare people. I feel exactly the same way. Like, and your intention wasn't to say like, if you said any of these things, you're a jackwagon and your friends deserve better than you. Right. I mean, that's not what we're trying to do. But I think it is recognizing that, I think it's a mindset thing. Let's say it was my husband and he needed my support. And actually right now he does, because farming sucks. And he does have a very difficult time like holding all of the stress that he feels. So for me, it's about intention. My intention for him isn't to fix him or to solve a problem for him, because that's not my job. My job is to love him and be there for him through it. And I think sometimes we get too hung up on exactly what to say. Like you said, it's just be there. If you really love them, just be there for them. Maybe it is like as simple as holding their hand. Maybe it's not touching them at all, but it's simply letting them know, like, I love you and I'm here for you, whatever you need. And like you said, they may not be able to articulate it, but I think sometimes we worry too much about the perfect wording and less about the intention behind it all. So
absolutely.
So Tiff, you shared a lot about the kind of the organizations that you've worked with. And I think that's a great way to kind of wrap up this conversation, because I think you've given people a lot of things to think about. And ultimately, all I want is for people to stop thinking about this like something that only happens to other people. I have 5 people in my family, in my little family, my nuclear family. There's me, my husband, and we have 3 kids. That means statistically, one of us is going to struggle with this, right? Mm-hmm. And so this isn't something that happens to other people. It happens to all of us. And we're all touched by it. And I really pray that this becomes something that we all can be a little more comfortable leaning into and talking about, so the people that are struggling don't feel so damn alone. And along with that, there are organizations that you've worked with personally. And I had mentioned, I will link to all of these organizations in the show notes, anything that you mentioned. But are there some specific ones that you think are particularly helpful if people are listening and need help?
Sure, absolutely. And I appreciate you sharing the information as well. I would say the 2 that I personally am most familiar with would be the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And there is a North Dakota chapter, and there's often individuals in smaller communities and across the state as well. But they also provide some hotline information. So if you're having these conversations and they're bigger than you and you don't know, and you're concerned and what you're saying isn't helping and they're not getting better, certainly reach out and use those resources. And the AFSP does a great job of educating and really providing resources for people. And then the other one that I'm close to is Imagine Thriving, and they're out of Fargo and they're continuing to grow their footprint. But they are a great resource for individuals with children, with students. So they provide access to care for individuals. One of the things that Imagine Thriving has in research and studies is that one of the greatest barriers for children receiving care is simply a ride to and from a doctor's appointment. So Imagine Thriving helps to cover rides to doctor's appointments if parents can't leave work. They help to cover the cost of medications, and oftentimes they help to cover the cost of a doctor's appointment. So the last thing we want people to worry about when they're in a crisis situation is the cost of getting help.
How am I going to pay for it?
Those are
right.
Yeah. So those are probably the two that I'm closest to and the most familiar with that I think do some really great things in our state of North Dakota.
Awesome. Tiff, you're a beautiful soul. You always have been, ever since I've met you. And I just think that all I can do is encourage you to keep sharing your story as the opportunity presents itself. I mean, every time you're asked, I hope you're able to say yes. People need to hear this, and they need to see somebody like you, because I'm sure that you have been, and this maybe is very presumptuous of me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm guessing that you have been likened to your father a lot. I did not meet your dad, but the way that you described him is exactly the way that I would use very similar words to describe you. You're the type of person you're funny and you're snarky and you're sassy and you're fun, and you walk into a room and you make people feel good to be around you. I mean, these are beautiful qualities, right? So I do think that, not that I'm saying like, Tiff, you need to carry the banner and be the poster child for this, because I don't think that that's anybody's mantle of responsibility. But I appreciate you taking the time to share it with us and with this audience, because in small towns in rural America, like we need people that we see as like that we can relate to, and we can say, oh my gosh, like this is how I'm feeling too, because it's already isolating, like living in small town can be kind of isolating anyway. And I just don't want anybody to suffer alone. And so please keep sharing your story.
No, and I appreciate you saying that. And of course, all the kind words, but for what it's worth, and to anyone who may be listening, it's not easy to share it either. But I don't want to be a hypocrite and tell all these people and just share my dad's story and not go into my own personal struggles. But it is scary to put yourself out there and to be vulnerable and to worry, will people judge me? Will people think that I'm not capable of being a successful employee or being a successful mom? But I am all those things. And this doesn't define, it is a part of who I am, but it is not the only part of me. It's a small piece. But I'm sharing that just because even having this conversation, it's scary. I get nervous who's going to hear and who's going to judge me. And honestly, if I want to help other people, then I have to be comfortable sharing this so that they feel comfortable getting help.
Right. And that is the truth for all of us. If I think everybody would agree that there's still this stigma, but nobody wants to go first, like nobody wants to say, yeah, there's a stigma, but I'm not quite ready to help overcome it, So I can appreciate how challenging this is. I hope that you felt safe. I hope that you feel secure.
Oh, yeah.
And obviously, like I said, we don't know who's going to listen to this. And that is the risk that you're taking. And I'm so proud of you for being brave and just leaning out into that, because it's not an easy thing to do. But I know this is going to help so many people. And I just can't thank you enough for coming on today, Tiff.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, and obviously for talking about something that is really, really important and needs to be talked about. So I appreciate that.
Thanks, Tiff.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Small Town Big Talk Show. If you enjoyed today's show, we invite you to subscribe on Stitcher, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts, and we'd love for you to leave us a 5-star review. The more reviews we get, the easier it will be for other small town friends to find us. We encourage you to keep on living big in your small town, because the size of your life is not determined by your zip code.